Hello, we're here for part 3. Um, Boy, I was gonna just try to really get this testimony streamlined, and I've just been messing up ever since. Well, the very first one, part 1, I said this is gonna be abbreviated. I was gonna do it in, 30 to 45 minutes, the whole story, the whole 60 years, and then I was gonna go later and do the long one. But apparently I am not capable of that. And so what I promised at the beginning of part 1 was not true. I repent and I apologize. It was not something I could do. So anyway, then on top of that, the first video, the battery died probably 20 to 30 minutes before I noticed it. And I'm just going to have to do my best to piece together what, as I go along, I might bring back old memories because I'm pretty sure it never made it to the first video. I would like to start off by saying, because I've already mentioned that we were poor, and that's a very relative term in the United States, or at least was for me as a child, because I had not, until I was, except for seeing a few hobos at trash cans in LA when I was 9 or 10 years old. I never saw poverty. I just didn't see it. I never saw it. I just didn't even know. I didn't even know. They didn't have it on TV. Nobody talked about it. So we were not poor in the sense of really poor. One of my dearest friends now was poor, like really poor. She lived in New Jersey, and her mother had a lot of children, and they got their electricity turned off a lot, and she remembers waking up in the winter and there was ice on the floor. She had to walk on ice on the floor in her own bedroom, and her mother would ask her to go ask neighbors for food. That's how hungry they were, and she hated doing that. And that, I never saw, I didn't know we had that kind of poverty in the United States when I was a kid. And so it's sort of when I said I was poor, I was thinking in the relative terms that I used to think when I was that age. I thought we were poor because everybody else I knew got to drink real milk, and we had to drink powdered skim milk and things like that, or they had nice changes of clothes, and I only had like 5 different things I could wear and just keep changing them Monday through Friday. I thought that was poor. But that was not poor. It was just poor in comparison to, I would say that in comparison to the other, well, just say white people. I was mostly around white people. I didn't even live in a town where I even saw black people, hardly ever, until we moved to Texas. And even then, I saw the black kids sitting in the back of the classroom, and I thought it was because they didn't like us and didn't want to talk to us. I didn't know why they were in the back of the room. And I didn't know how poor they were, but I started to learn slowly. It took me a while, but it turned out that there was a sort of shanty town not very far from where we lived, and it's very, very sad how people lived. It was terrible. It was really terrible, and they were really poor. And compared to that, I had no right to say that we were poor. I mean, my dad actually hired housekeepers. I mean, that doesn't sound poor, does it? but he hired housekeepers. But then once he quit being a stockbroker and we moved to Texas, um, on his associate professor salary was much less. And of course, he didn't have to pay a housekeeper anymore because he married his girlfriend. And, but we didn't get to have things like whole milk, or there's a lot of things that were really bad for us that I'm lucky we couldn't have. Like, we couldn't have soda pops, it had to be Kool-Aid. And most of the meat was spam, and you know, it was just we weren't that poor. I mean, we lived in a nice house with a big yard. I mean, it was not a nice house maybe, but it was not a bad house. It was an okay house. And anyway, so I apologize for saying we were poor. That was an overstatement. That I just thought we were poor because I was comparing myself to all my friends who their families would go on vacations during the year, and they had really what I thought was really great food, and some of it wasn't so great. That was a big junk food season of America, so I was probably better off not having anything I wanted, because I would have wanted all the worst things. Anyhow, now that I've gotten that off my chest, and I'm just not going to worry about what got erased or not recorded in that first testimony. It was probably not that important. The most important thing was also saying how I had turned to the occult for my answers, because I needed answers. I wanted to be a daddy's girl. I wanted my daddy to be proud of me, and I knew he would not be proud of me if I was into Jesus. And I didn't personally dislike Jesus or anything, but I picked my dad over Jesus. And I was just about 12 at that time that I did that I picked. Well, I was 11 really, but anyway, when we moved there and had the stepmother, that was age 12. And let's move on now. The reason I mentioned it near the end of that first video, that my dad had further financial problems, is it turned out that the very inexpensive house he had bought in Texas in College Station turned out to have a lien on it. And my dad, to save money, had not checked out those things when he bought it, and so he didn't really buy it. He didn't really own it. And so that was what I was referring to. So when we first moved to Colorado, because he decided he didn't want to be a professor anymore, and I think he got some kind of job at another stock brokerage company. It was a different one. It was another well-known one, but I don't remember the names anymore. Anyway, he didn't make a whole lot of money, that's for sure. But, or if he did, he was spending it somewhere that I will maybe never know. And so we ended up having to move into it was a small 2-bedroom apartment with a basement in Denver, when we had to leave the house that he thought he was going to be able to buy, which is a 3-bedroom house and big yard and a kind of nice neighborhood. And but before I go into that, I'm pretty sure that everything I said about living in Littleton got deleted. Probably. And if it didn't, and I'm saying this twice, I apologize, but I just don't know how else to do my testimony except these long strings of part 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But Littleton is important to me. Wait a minute, I might have done that in... Okay. I'm going to abbreviate for a short time here because I can't deal with this. I just can't figure it all out. What did I say? What did I not say? And even if I listen to the video, then I forget again. So, the most important things I want to say about when I lived in Littleton was that I had played with magic. Well, I didn't call it magic, but it was, I wanted to find out if witchcraft, if it really worked for some reason. Even though in College Station, when I first was reading from the book club when I was 12, I had no interest in witchcraft, but by the time I was 14 or 15, I suddenly found that very interesting and I wanted to do it. I thought it seemed fun. That's how it was. I think that's because it's how it was presented to me on TV. I was very programmed by society. I was very, very deeply programmed by Southern California society and my dad, who was all for it, and, just. It was early, it was before the New Age, or before most people knew of the New Age beliefs that are common today. But it was definitely the big start of it, and I was totally ready to be, totally programmed, and that's what I was about at least a few things. Like sexual immorality, I did not think it was immoral for a person to have sex with many different partners without being married. That's what I saw, and that's what I saw in my life, and I was told there was nothing wrong with it by the person I idolized, which was my father, and the society around me totally agreed. And so it became a deep, strong belief in me that there was nothing wrong with treating sex like, I don't know, maybe the way other people go to a football game. My only rule about it was don't do it if you don't want to. Thank goodness I had that rule because there was enough times that I didn't want to. There was way too many times that I did. And I repent for that. Well, anyhow. I believe, especially looking at my own life and from what I've read in the Bible, the more we sin, the more our heart gets hardened to it. We just our mind refuses to see it as a bad thing. That's what happens. I believe that's really what happens with me. That happened just with certain topics. And for me, the two topics that happened for me was, the first one was the sexual immorality. If somebody was hurt, that was a different story. If it was a child with an adult, I didn't ever think that was all right. Some really, really obvious stuff was obvious to me, stayed obvious to me is really bad. And, but anyhow, the older I got and the more I did do things that I now know and I came to know are against God's laws in the Bible, the more hard-hearted I became in certain ways. I would hurt people without even realizing it because I wouldn't think about it. I wasn't thinking about them. I was thinking about me. And I was busy just being the victim of my circumstances. And yeah, there were some things about my circumstances that really sucked. But, all in all, compared to a whole lot of people in the world, I had a very nice life. I had food, shelter, and clothing all the time. They were always provided for me, and I was never afraid that we couldn't afford food. I was never afraid we couldn't afford the clothes I needed. And I was also very unafraid to go out on all my little adventures. And I didn't care what other people thought. that's how my dad kind of taught me to be. I don't mean to blame him, but I'm just saying that path was wide open for me, and I took it, and I followed my own views on everything. If I thought it, then it had to be true. I was one of the first New Age people to say, it's my truth. I wasn't saying that, but that's how I was. If I thought it was true, then it was true. And there was no, I had no instrument to compare it to say, well, is this really true over here? No, I didn't. It was just like, hey, that's what I think, so that's what's true. And I just got more and more that way. And then as a teenager, I was also very emotional, as I had been as a child. I wanted love, and I started, as the old saying goes, looking for love in all the wrong places, which in that case was boys. And the first guy, well, let's just say I lost my innocence at a young age. I was 16 or 17. For some people, that's not a young age. I know for some people, the poor things, they're losing their virginity at 8 years old and 10 years old and 12 years old. And I'm aware of that now. I didn't know that before. And in some cultures, that's common. It's so sad. And in some cultures, even incest is common. And that's so sad. There's so many sad things going on in this world I didn't know about. But I wasn't even worrying about it. I was just worried about myself. And the more I worried about myself, the more I was becoming what people today call narcissistic. Because that was the when I say there's something to compare it to, if this is the wrong or right thing to do, what I would compare it to is what do I think? What do I feel? That was my meter. That was bad. That was really not good. And I feel so grateful to Jesus that somehow he had the patience. He was always there. I mean, he was always there in the sense that he always knew exactly what was going on, and he fixed things in such a way that I might go through a lot of suffering, because I had to until I got right with God. I had to, because I was just begging for hell in so many things I did. I was begging for death. In fact, I wanted to die. I consciously wanted to die for years as a teenager. And I remember there was one particular year, the only way that I could cheer myself up, I thought, was by fantasizing killing myself. I remember reading a little part of a book that was really popular at the time called Steppenwolf, which went right over my head. I really didn't understand what that book was trying to tell me. But there was a certain part of the book where the guy would go in the mornings into the bathroom, and he'd pull a razor out and he'd look at it and think about how he could kill himself with it, and then he'd put the razor back. And that was sort of like how he was, I thought that's how he's keeping himself alive, was just with the fantasy of the delightfulness of how wonderful it would be if he killed himself. And I went through a long period of time. I'm not sure exactly how long it was, but it was at least months. All I wanted to do was sleep. I didn't want to live in this world. I didn't want to be in this world. And as much as I could get away with it, I had a bedroom in the basement. We finally got a house in Denver. After living that apartment, after a year or two, we got a house. And there were only 2 bedrooms upstairs. That was my little brother and my parents in the other room, and then I had a basement room. And I liked it. It was kind of like having my own little apartment because there was there a bathroom down there? I think so, but I can't even remember for sure anymore. Anyway, I was okay with it, whatever it was, and I would just go down there, and people would, nobody would check on me. I mean, there was just, uh, I was, it was kind of like living alone in my family. I guess is how I'd put it, and I'm not complaining. They were very kind to me, considering all that. I was just like a parasite. All I did was eat their food and have them spend money on me, and I didn't do anything. I did very little to contribute to the family, and um, I started getting more and more into occult things, which I now consider to be a cult. I used to think were just spiritual and good. One of the things that really threw me off in my life was that for a very long time, if something was quote unquote spiritual, then it was automatically good to me. I mean, unless there was something about it that was scary or felt evil, and if that happened, then I didn't think it was good to be on a spiritual level. Then I didn't like it. But I tended to think of the word spiritual as just being all encompassing of good stuff. And, people would talk about spirit guides. I tried to get one, but I just never felt, it just didn't ever feel right. I just didn't want to do it. I believe that is an example of the Holy Spirit keeping me out of danger, because I can get very extreme when I believe in things. I try to go all the way with things. I'm not one of those people that just wants to compromise. I just want to get into it. And so when you don't have a good moral and spiritual God-centered compass in this world, that can be very dangerous. I would say that I was the kind of personality that could have ended up easily dead a long time before now. Anyhow, I really do see that, even though at the time I didn't appreciate all the suffering I went through, and the only reason I did not kill myself when I was a teenager was because luckily one of my occult beliefs was from a nutty Tibetan Buddhist. I call him nutty now. I used to think he was so awesome. But he was talking about really weird stuff, like how he'd gone to a monastery in his Tibetan Buddhism thing, and they had drilled a hole in the front of his forehead to open his third eye. I wasn't interested in any of that, and my stepmother actually read that book that had that in there, and when I got into other weird things, she said, "Promise me you don't let them drill a hole in your forehead." That was so sweet. She said that, huh? Anyway, but I just like, oh well, he's more advanced than me. I wouldn't do that. And then he had all this stuff about astral projection and reincarnation, and he even wrote a book that he said was written by his cat. That was a very boring book, by the way. I don't know, maybe if you're a serious animal lover, maybe. I love animals, I don't dislike them, but it was a very boring book. Anyhow, when I was reading his stuff, something he said that the Tibetan Buddhist believed, and I don't know if this is what they really believe or not, because there's so many branches of all the religions. As far as I can tell, if you have somebody from any religion tell you something, it's not necessarily what the other ones believe. I'll tell you that much. It's crazy. It's crazy out there. But anyway, even Christianity. You'll have people that identify as Christians and they'll tell you stuff that is so totally, like, I'm a Christian witch. They don't even realize that that's an oxymoron. It's impossible to be a Christian witch. That is an abomination to God, witchcraft. And if you're a Christian, you are not going to be a witch. Period. I mean, you're not. If you are, then you're not reading the Bible. You're not going by the Bible. You're going by some New Age channeled book, or you're just not going by any book, and you're just going like I used to, and just whatever I think is true, and that's it. But anyhow, one of his beliefs that I believed because he believed it was Lobsang Rampa is who I'm talking about, by the way. He put out a number of books back in I guess it was the 70s. And anyway, one of the things he said was that if the karma for committing suicide was that you would have to come back and go through all of it all over again, whatever happened to you in that lifetime that made you kill yourself, you were going to have to go through it all over again. And that was the one thing I was not willing to do. And honestly, that is the only reason I did not pursue actually killing myself when I was like 16 or 17. Yeah, about 16 or 17. And so anyhow, I had a situation with my parents. I was brought up to not be racist. One of my earliest memories was going to a little country store in Texas. She was only about 19 or 20 years old, and she was very forward thinking. She was one of those people that was very definitely for the civil rights movement. Although I didn't know what that was, and I was only 2 or 3. And we went to a store, and there was this little girl who was black, and she was my size, and she looked at me real mean and stuck out her tongue. And I thought that was mean. So I walked over and tugged on my mother's dress, and she says, what is it? And I pointed to that little girl, and I said, I don't like her. And then my mother gave me a lecture on how I was never to dislike somebody because of their skin color and how wrong that was. And I was so fascinated by her lecture that I didn't even bother to defend myself and explain that that wasn't why I said that. I thought it was very edifying to me. I really appreciate that little lecture I got on how to not be racist. That was awesome. Well, anyway, because it really stuck for me. I do not judge people by their skin. Everybody is an individual, and each one of us is responsible for what we do. And you can't just say, oh, so-and-so made me do it. Yeah, it can get to a point, yeah, they made you do it. They ordered you to do it, and if you didn't do it, they were going to kill you or whatever they were going to do. But we have free will. And if we really are against something, we don't compromise. No compromising. Anyway, that's how I feel about the racial thing. But what happened was, I've been brought up to not be racist, and I just assumed that there was a couple reasons I had to believe it, because of things my dad had said as well, and my stepmother too. I assumed we were a totally non-racist family, but this was a time in Denver that was a very heated racial things going on. I guess the Black Panthers existed at that point. And there were little groups in Denver that were very black militant groups. And people were afraid of them. They were very aggressive and violent to a certain degree. I didn't like hearing about it, and I didn't pay much attention when I did hear about it. I was just glad that I wasn't experiencing it. Although I did experience it a little bit because I got bussed in as a white kid to a predominantly black high school. That was my choice. I was not forced to do that. But the all white high school I went to had such ridiculous rules that I stubbornly insisted that I was going to drop out of school if my parents didn't let me bus in as a white kid to this predominantly black school. And that's where I found out that, yeah, there really is some of this anger going on. And in fact, we had things like people throwing Coke bottles at toward our heads during lunchtime, just because we were white, from black people. That did happen. I mean, but God saved me from being hit by a bottle, and that didn't happen all the time. It just happened sometimes. And the other thing is, I kept walking. I would walk through this area to go to the grocery store at lunchtime, and there was a gang of black girls, plus one albino black girl. So she wasn't really black, but she identified as black, and she was the one who was picking on me the most. And I'd be walking by, and she'd go, "What's your name?" And I just didn't know how to deal with it. I just would ignore them, and that all seemed to work fine. They never came after me. But one time after school, there was a little group of black boys, and that got scary. And for a minute there, I was afraid I was about to be mugged or molested or something. And one person in that group said, "Leave her alone," and they all listened, and I was able to get away. I'm so thankful. And I believe that some angel got that. Maybe he was an angel who said that. I don't know. But it was some angel that told him to say it for sure. That's what I think. So I knew that there was some real anger going on. But I didn't, I just tended to shine it on. And anyhow, I had a girlfriend that lived across the street, and she only liked black boys. She was, I think, maybe a year younger than me, and she only wanted to date black boys, and she only wanted to listen to what was considered to be black music at the time, like the Jackson 5, and I don't remember the other names of the people she listened to, but she and I got to be friends because she lived right across the street, and she was the only friend I had in the neighborhood. And she was actually, her mother was German, and the father, I don't know, the father was just not there. And her mother was very racist, at least to the point where she was not allowed to have friends that were black or date people that were black. And so she had to keep it a secret. But she would wear the kind of clothes, that were real popular for the Soul Sisters, and she would, that's the only kind of music she'd listen to, and she was constantly dancing to it. I'd go over to visit with her, and she'd always be up, "One bad apple don't spoil the whole bunch, girl." And she was a good dancer. She'd be dancing and dancing. And she had a great figure, and I think it was from all that constant dancing. Anyhow, she was telling me, "Oh, black boys are so great. They are just the best." She was just like, "Oh, you don't want to go out with anybody but a black guy. They are so good." And finally she decided that I should go on a double date with her. And I said, "Well, I didn't even know anybody black at the time as a personal friend. But I was open to experiences, and I was not racist. And my parents never put that one time they tried to put a boundary for me, which is that I had to be home by midnight when I was doing rehearsals for plays when I was in Littleton. But I ended up not following the rules, and they ended up giving up trying to control me in any way. And they really weren't, I don't think they even wanted to know. I don't know. They didn't care. Or they acted like they didn't care. And I could do anything I wanted. I didn't ask. I just told them I'm going to go spend the night at so and so's tonight or whatever. It wasn't ever can I do it. And so, in my opinion, I knew I could go out with a black guy, and I knew it would be okay with my parents. But she said, please don't tell them because they might tell my mother and I would be in so much trouble. And I didn't want her to get in trouble. Said, okay, well, they don't care anyway, and they're not going to ask anyway, so sure, I won't tell them. Well, this turns into a longer story, but basically what happened was it was a guy that was a few years older than me, and he was a Golden Glove champion. And all his friends apparently were extremely impressed by that. Of course, I'm not into violence or boxing, so that didn't really impress me, but I knew that he was a strong, bulky guy and was very proud of his accomplishments. And he was a nice guy, and I didn't mind going out. And then, so he ended up inviting me out on other dates, and it was just weird to me. I couldn't relate, and he'd play this song on the radio, Mama, I think I found that girl, like he was wooing me. And then our dates would be just driving through the city park, which was a very large park in Denver. And we wouldn't go anywhere. We'd just drive real slow through the park, and he'd see people he knew. And I just couldn't really relate to it. It just wasn't my thing. And then a point came where I don't remember exactly how it happened, but we ended up in a car with, I guess, four black guys and me. And we were in the grocery store parking lot of a King Soopers in Denver. And they made a game out of whenever they would see some white people about to walk by the car, then Larry would kiss me. And then they would laugh and talk about how, oh yeah, that was real shocking them to see him kissing her. And I realized how I was just being used. And, what before was something I couldn't really relate to, somehow he didn't seem so nice anymore. I didn't like being used that way. But I was way too much of a wuss to say so. I just decided I was going to quit going out with him. And so the next time he called me, I said, well, I can't relate. I'm not going to go out with you anymore. And he was convinced that my father found out, and that the reason I wasn't going to go out with him anymore was because I wasn't allowed to. And that wasn't true. My dad didn't even know. And I told him that, and he didn't believe me. And then he threatened me. He said, if your dad doesn't let you come date me, then I'm going to have it was some little militant, or maybe it was big, I don't know if it was big or little, some black militant group he was in Denver. He said, we'll come and bomb your neighborhood. And that was awfully melodramatic, but it scared me because it was like he was trying to force me with violence. And I got hysterical on the phone and shouted at him something like, leave me alone or whatever. And I hung up, and I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to tell my dad. Because what if they do come around and cause some problem? So I told my dad. And by the way, my stepmother was 8 months pregnant at this time. It was not very good timing. And I was so afraid and so freaked out because I'd never had anybody threaten me with violence like that before. But I didn't see it as a black thing. I just knew it's a particular group of people who have a belief system that I disagree with, and I don't like violence. I didn't think of it as, all black people are bad or anything. I just, somehow deep in me, I do not believe in racism. We are all the same color inside of us. We all bleed red blood, and I just don't even think that in the real world that we're going to end up in heaven on the new earth, the new heaven on earth. I don't think we're even going to be different skin colors. I think we're all going to be the same color as far as our skin, or pretty close to the same color. I don't think we're going to even have that. But that's just my opinion. It's not in the Bible. I don't know. I just have a habit of telling my opinions once in a while. Anyway, my dad ended up saying something racist it was a word. He used the N-word. I couldn't believe it. I had never heard my dad use the N-word. We always used the word that was considered the most respectful at the time. When I was in first and second and third grade, we were supposed to call them Negroes. That was the respectful thing. People who didn't respect them as much called them colored, or I don't know what else. I can't remember what else they called them, because I didn't hang out with racists. And although some of my dad's family I think they were racist, and I don't remember. I think they called them colored. And they thought it was weird that I called them Negroes, but I knew it was out of respect, so I stuck with it. And then I found out just through the media that was no longer considered respectful, and that, oh yeah, it was Bill Cosby and all that stuff, and say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud. And I thought, wow, I was really surprised they wanted to be called black, but I thought, well, that's not any weirder than being called white, because I'm not white, and we call us white, and they're not black, but they call them black, so whatever. So I switched over to black. I just wanted to call whatever's the respectful name. Went through the same thing with Mexicans. At first they were Mexicans, and then that was considered racist, and they were, there was Latinas, and what was the word? It was Chicano. In Denver, it had to be Chicano. That was, if they were Mexican, they were Chicano, and any other word was not good. I even joined a Chicano power parade one time because I just thought equality for everybody was a good thing, and so I'll get in they'd go, Chicano, power, and I got in line, and I got in there, Chicano, power. I didn't even know anybody Mexican. So, see, I get myself in situations I don't even know what I'm doing. But nothing bad happened out of that, but anyhow. My dad not only used the N-word, he said something like, I know how to deal with these N's. I couldn't believe my dad said that. That sounded like something a racist would say, and I never had, all in my whole 17 years, had never thought of my dad as a racist. Quite the opposite. And then he got out his rifle. I didn't even know he had a rifle. And then he called the neighbors. We lived on a catty corners, intersection in our neighborhood, and he contacted our neighbors, and at least two of them, I saw them out. I looked out the window and I saw them out there. They were wearing white shirts and were holding rifles. I thought this was after actually the cars started coming around. I forgot to mention that. Larry and some of his friends started driving in front of our house really slow. And then they'd come around and they'd drive out. It was just like it was threatening. It was very threatening. And my dad, contacted the neighbors, and they got out their rifles. I think they called the police, and the police said they haven't done anything, so we can't do anything unless they do something. And I was just totally freaking out. And I said, I called a friend of mine that didn't live too far away. And I said, could I spend the night at your house? I can't deal with what's going on at my house. And she said, sure. And I asked my dad if he would take me there, and he did. He dropped me off at her house, and then he went back. And I got a phone call from my stepmother. She said, Michelle, I know your father has told you not to tell me, but you have got to tell me why your father is sitting on the couch, looking out the curtains, holding a rifle. Oh, my poor mom. He didn't tell her. She had no idea what was going on. And no, he had not told me not to tell her. And I told her. And poor thing. So, nothing happened. No violence happened. It all calmed down. And then it was over. But it was not over for the resentment that was felt toward me for causing that situation in our family. And that was made to me very clear a few weeks later when my dad picked me up from another friend's house after I'd spent the night there. And all the way home, which was a pretty long way, it was at least a 30-minute drive, he told me, I'm glad I can't remember everything he said, but this is how it went. I don't care if you kill yourself. I'm not your father. I don't care if you get sick and die. I'm not your father. I don't care if you get strung up on heroin and become a heroin addict and live on the streets. I'm not your father. I don't care if you get pregnant and need a home. I'm not your father. And he just went on everything he could think of for the whole 30 minutes home. That was exactly the structure of the sentences. And of course, I was blubbering, crying all the way home. And then we get to the house, and I go downstairs where my bedroom is. And next to my bedroom was the little area for the washing machines and the ironing board. And my stepmother was down there ironing. And I went down there, and she said, Michelle, why are you crying? And I told her what Daddy had just said. And she set down the iron, and she looked at me, and she said, well, I don't blame him. I don't like you either. And so I was about to turn 17, I think the next week or two. And they knew me well enough to know that I will not stay where I know I'm not welcome. And so that's why they did it that way. I believe that's why they did it that way. And when you think about it, it was a lot kinder than having me put in an institution or something. I mean, me personally, I'd rather it had been the way it happened than being put in some awful delinquent's place or whatever, who knows, you know. So to me, that was, I know they didn't know what to do, and it didn't seem like a kind choice to me at the time, but looking back, I think it was probably the kindest choice they could have picked. And so when my birthday came a couple weeks later, I had gotten it worked out. I had found a friend who, back then, the rent didn't cost that much, especially in certain areas, and I had a friend from high school who had an apartment with an extra bedroom, and he was willing to let me live at his house as long as I needed. And we were not boyfriend and girlfriend, never were. And but I took advantage of his generosity, and I got a job, a 12-hour-a-day job, and just worked my bottom off for a couple of months until I got enough money to fly to Texas. And I didn't know what I was going to do, but I had friends in Texas and that lived in Austin. And well, I'm not going to go on and on with that story, except to say that um, I was still not turning to God. I didn't even see that. I mean, I thought I was turning to God just to believe in the stuff I believed in. And I was still real into believing in karma and stuff. And I just like, well, I hope my karma is good enough that, you know, that I find a place to live and that I can sleep and not be hurt by anybody. I just really, I was just living on a hope without a prayer, pretty much. And I had a friend that thankfully asked me once it came to be evening. I was about to leave his apartment. They had an extra bedroom. And he said, "Do you have a place to sleep tonight?" And I was so thankful. I didn't know. I was probably going to go sleep behind a dumpster. I knew nothing about how to be homeless. And I said, "No." And he said, "Oh, well, you can stay here." Well, anyway, I apologize for going off on all that. And I don't know how and why that would be part of my testimony. But I guess we're just going to have to move on. You know, when you're going through your life story, it's hard not to mention some of these really big things that happen. My little brother, he's six years younger than me. He went through a lot harder time. He went to high schools where they actually had to close down the schools because of the militant protests and things. And um, I don't know if he finished high school either. I dropped out with my parents' permission. I dropped out, and pretty sure he dropped out too. And anyway, we were not, like I said, we had sibling rivalry, but deep down we loved each other, but that was about it. I always thought of him as being very opposite of me. So, anyhow, hopefully that was an interesting enough story that you're not too aggravated that it had nothing to do with Jesus, except for that I believe that Jesus kept me alive in that one too. And I believe that Jesus helped make the decision that I would be, just have my feelings hurt so bad that I would run away. Because for me, that was the least suffering. It would have been much more suffering for me. And I don't think very helpful if I got been put in some institution and drugged or whatever they do to people, or raped or whatever, you know, who knows. I just am appreciative that I had that freedom. So anyhow, all those things were going on. And then after 6 months, you know, I wrote to my parents because I had left them a message when I ran away, because I just went to school one day acting like it was a normal day, and I just never came home. That's how I did it. And what they did was they cleaned out my whole bedroom. I found this out later. They cleaned out my whole bedroom, sterilized it, made it all white walls, white bed sheet. I had a bed on the floor. They put a bed up, you know, on a frame, and rented out my room. And they threw away all my artwork that I had on the walls and stuff. And so anyway, what happened was 6 months later or so, my parents were in Texas because that's where family is and all. And I had written them because I didn't want them to worry about me. And just to let them know I was all right. And so they knew where I was, and they came to visit and invited me to come home. My stepmother was very apologetic. She felt really bad, and she confessed to me that she and her dad had planned the whole thing, that they'd been mean to me on purpose so that I would run away. And I understand. I look back now and I go, gosh, she was about to finally have a child. She'd already had, in the teens, miscarriages. So many miscarriages. And because of some new drug that is no longer legal, she actually ended up having two babies. But anyway, that was going to be her first one. And that was not good. They didn't need my drama. And anyway, they did invite me back, and I went back for a short while. And I totally skipped over all the stuff about how I tried to learn to do astral projection when I was 15, before we moved into the house, when we were still in the apartment. And I would seek out old bookstores. That was before the internet. You couldn't find stuff on the internet. There was no internet to find stuff on. At least maybe they had one in the military, but I didn't have an internet. And so all I could do is go to used bookstores and search. And I found a book. I wanted to learn how to do astral projection. Believe it or not, that used to be really hard to find a book that would tell you how to do that. And so I found a book. It was by some guy from India. And he had a part in it where he was warning people. He says, now you got to understand, when you go in to do astral projection, there's going to be little demons there, and they think it's fun to scare you. And you have to just not let them scare you. And I was like, what? The wuss in me said, oh, no, no, no. I do not want to do astral projection. I have no interest in meeting any demons. I didn't spend any time thinking about whether I believed in them. I just knew if they did exist, I didn't want to have anything to do with them. That had always been my policy. So, although up until I got that book, I was trying to do it, and I think at one point I actually did see my bed down from above. But I think that was just a dream now that I think about it, because I wasn't in the bed. I just was seeing the bed. Maybe I levitated. No, so I guess I never did. I astral project. Oh, okay, so oh gosh, it's such a long story. My life is such a long story. So it didn't. I stayed there for a while. They had some rules for me. If I lived with my parents, they had this funny idea that if I didn't wear certain clothes, that it would make me act right. They might as well told me just drink a cup of act right, because there is no such thing. But they said, okay, you can't wear bell bottoms, and you can't wear blue jeans. And if you'll agree to those rules, then we'll let you stay here. Isn't that weird? Well, anyway, that was the rules, because I was a real big on blue jeans. And so, but I found out they were okay with jeans as long as they weren't blue. But it was hard to find any that didn't have like stripes or something. But anyway, I lived in the clothes that they wanted me to live in for the time that I was there. I went back to school I think I might have gone back to school for a while. That doesn't matter. I wasn't there very long. It didn't work out. I moved out, and I got involved with, I left out the whole thing about living with a guru. I lived in an ashram for 3 years in Denver with a guru, and I thought it was during a time I was really upset, and I was always really upset. I was crying all the time. I was an emotional mess for a good strong 10 years. And I stayed an emotional mess. I started crying a little bit less, but it was a very emotional time in my life. And I still believed in God, but I didn't know who he was, and I didn't know his address. But I just believed that if I said something to God, I just thought he heard me. And I was very angry with God. And I remember telling him, I try to play by your rules, and this is what I get. What did I mean by that? I wasn't trying to play by his rules. I only knew 1 or 2 of them. I did play by those 2 rules. Treat others the way you'd like to be treated. As long as I would think this is how I'd want to be treated. I look more deeply into some of these things, and that is not how I would like to be treated. But I did have that as that golden rule was important to me, and forgiving people easily. The importance of forgiveness, I understood. And I had been forgiving people all my life. And so to me, that meant I was playing by his rules. I had no idea about, I didn't know what half the sins were. I really didn't. And so anyway, I was saying, I play by your rules and all I get is kicked around by this world. And if you don't help me within a couple weeks, I'm just going to kill myself by overdosing on heroin. Because the one thing I would never, ever, ever do was stick a needle in my arm with heroin in it. And so that's where I decided, okay, I'll just go ahead and make sure I'm getting a dose that will kill, and I'll inject it. And that was how I was going to kill myself. And I already knew this little guru that was in town, and I'd already thought, I'd seen his little flyer. It was such a lie. It had a picture. He was sort of a sort of fat kid. He was 13 years old in the picture. I think he was 14 by that time though. And he had a lei on his, no shirt, and wearing a lei, and it had a quote from him: "I am the source of peace in this world, but what can I do unless people come to me without cheat and deceit?" I'm like, that sounded so holy. It sounded like, wow, I wonder. And then I remembered when I was in that occult book club, I had read a book that was, I think it was written by a guy that was psychic. And so he's making all these prophecies. And one of his prophecies was that a child would come and lead us. And that all sounded real holy. It sounded, that's actually in the Bible, but not leading us. The child is leading the animals in the heaven. I didn't know all that. I just thought, oh, so the future savior of the world is probably going to be a child. That's kind of what I got out of that prophecy. So when I heard he was only 13 or 14, I thought, ooh, this might be the one. And here he is in the flyer. He says, "I'm the source of peace in this world." And so I was giving it careful consideration, because I had met a guy he was actually the same guy who let me stay in his apartment for free when I had run away from home. And he always had a crush on me. He knew that I knew that. But he was just not my type or something, I was glad to be a friend, but, and he accepted that. But one of the reasons I did not feel attracted to him was because I thought of him as very pesky, like a pest. It was like he was always trying to do stuff to get attention, and it just bugged me. Very pesty. And so, anyhow, I met him in the very first apartment it was my very own apartment in Denver. I had a job bussing tables, and it was a very cheap apartment with no furniture except for a bed on the floor. And but it was my own apartment, and it had a kitchen, a tiny kitchen, but it even had a little table in there. It was really cheap. I wish I could remember how much it was, but it was probably something like $60 a month. I mean, that's how cheap rent was back then. It was in Denver, Colorado, about 1971 or 72. Okay, anyway, it wasn't a real nice apartment or anything, and there wasn't a garbage disposal in the sink, and there was no elevators. You had to walk up and down stairs, and it was old, and but when you're a kid and it's your very first own apartment, to me that was very exciting. But anyway, during that time, I had started taking speed, both to lose weight and to get up in the morning to go work. But not long after starting to take it, it made me very paranoid. And I hate paranoia. I don't like it. I would be in a room. I'd be in my little living room. There'd be a tiny hallway to get to the kitchen. My bedroom on the right and the bathroom on the left, and then there's the kitchen. And I'd be in the living room, and I would think I could hear voices in the kitchen. I couldn't really hear that well. But it was like voices in my head where it's, oh, they're talking about you. You know, they're saying bad things about you. I was just like that kind of paranoia, you know, just creepy. And then after a little while, I realized, geez, I only feel this way when I take speed. And it made me constipated, which I knew was not a good thing. So I thought, oh man, I just bought it. I had a pretty good amount of it. Probably would have lasted a month or two, but I didn't. And I didn't want to give it to anybody because then once I realized it was really unhealthy, and do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. And I don't want somebody giving me something that they know is poison. So I wasn't going to give it to anybody. And I just flushed it down the toilet. Not understanding the sewer system, but anyway, that's what I did. And I had also by that time, this was all left out of my testimony from before, where I had smoked weed and I'd taken LSD, a very, very, very light dose